Hi, my name's Andy Tidy and welcome back to another episode of Canal Hunter. This episode is a little bit different from the normal. Instead of looking at old abandoned canals, I'm going to be looking into the history of canals, but I'm sharing this episode with a friend of mine who is on something of a quest. This is Kate Saffin. Now, I saw Kate recently as she forms one half of a theatre company called Alarum. I can never get that right. Alarum.
Okay. We're Alarum Productions.
Okay,
Comes from a Shakespearean stage direction. Alarums and excursions.
Excursions?
Yes. And it's... The name actually came in 2010 when I was working with another boat-based actor, but on a show which was a one-woman for Richard III. It was a reworking of Shakespeare's Richard III, and we were taking it to Edinburgh. And the company we need to form a company to take it, and it was actually Helen who came up with this wonderful stage direction of alarums and excursions. So we called it Alarum. And then later, when I met Heather Wasty, we thought, well, might as well adopt it. So that's what we...
Okay, that answers it. Doesn't guarantee that I'll get it right next time.
Don't worry.
Anyhow, I saw Kate performing with Heather at the BCNS's headquarters at the Pump House a few weeks ago, and she told me that she was on a bit of a quest. But before we tell you what we were looking for, and we actually are looking for some help from you guys, is that the speciality I felt about their performance was the amount of verbatim comment that they introduced from the history of the canals. So whereas I tend to look at the geography of the canals and what went there, what always interests me is the stories that went behind it, the people that lived on it, and that's the bit which I find really difficult to access. And that's the bit where Kate seems to excel and has made it her speciality. So do you want to tell me a bit about the last project you've been doing?
Ever since I moved onto a boat, I've been fascinated by the stories of the people behind all the amazing heritage. That was in 1999. Heather's family were very involved in the campaigning from the late 60s around the Black Country and on particularly the Staffs and Worcester and the Stourbridge canals. And so after we'd finished touring the stories of the women who worked on the boats during the war, I'm thinking about, well, where do we go next? The obvious thing was to move on in time. What came next? I'm particularly interested in that period just after the war, when Robert Aikman and Tom Rolt first met and the contribution their wives made. That's a slightly different story to what we're talking about today, but that's part of the trigger. And Heather knew many of the women who'd been involved alongside her parents. So that's where we started with I Dig Canals. Show my little... So this is one of our leaflets from the project that we didn't really use because of lockdown. So we weren't able to do the events at the end. But I Dig Canals was a 70s slogan. Yeah, really.
I remember that.
And we managed to find a badge with it on.
Sure.
So we set off to listen to the stories of women in the Black Country. Did some research in the Waterways archive and found just one recording of a woman from that period.
Yeah.
There were some working boat women, but only one involved in the campaigning. And off we went with our recorders, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and collected 19 incredible long-form oral histories. And we ran some reminiscence events and some other things that brought in shorter stories. And the common thing we met all the time was women saying, oh, but I didn't really do anything.
Yeah.
But they did. They did a huge amount. The stories we have are incredible. They're often very everyday, managing to look after the children whilst bits of your show and tell blow away.
I find that's the problem with social history, is it seems so everyday at the time, and yet looking back on it, because no one bothers to record the everyday, it's the everyday that gets lost. You know what the Queen was doing in 1965 on the 5th of November, but you have no idea what the life of the everyday people was like. So I think
those everyday lives are our lives, because we're not in government or the royal family, or those lives are the lives that ours would have been like if we'd been there at the time.
Yes.
And I think what's important is that, as I said, when we started and we did some research, we found just the one recording. more and more people are coming to the canals, more and more people are interested.
Mm.
Some aren't at all interested in the heritage, and I'm hoping that things like this will catch their attention, and so they want to learn about that world.
Yes.
You know, for some, they want to learn about the engineering,
Yes.
and others, I hope, will want to learn about the people. And also, particularly with this campaigning and the restoration, those are the people we have to thank for having the canals at all.
I love some of the stories you've put in. I've got both of your books from the last two productions. The one that captures my mind, well,
It's the gear oil, isn't it? Yeah.
It's Jenny Hatton. I have to apologise. I'm going to spread the news far and wide. Tell me about the gear oil.
This, I think, is a wonderful story. This was when Jenny first met her future husband, Graham, and he took her off on his boat. This was in the 70s, and in those days most boats on the inland waterways were cruisers with outboard engines, and the protecting thing for an outboard engine is the shear pin. Jenny described it as being a bit like a fuse.
Yep.
Something catches on the propeller, the shear pin snaps, and so you get it cleaned off and you put a new one in. But you also have to reprime the engine with fresh oil. And on this occasion, in March, in the snow in Edgbaston, Graham had forgotten to bring any spare oil. So Jenny described how she found herself on her first trip out with Graham, who she's still very happily married to, straining gear oil through her tights.
So, every time I see Jenny now, the story of her tights and Graham's gear oil comes to mind. But it's stories like that which I think are fantastic to capture.
Although also I would say that really does stand out, because it was one of the most dramatic, and I had a lot of trouble when she was telling me not laughing so much that I ruined the recording. But equally, there's all sorts of really selling raffle tickets while trying to breastfeed the baby.
Yeah, yeah.
Stuffing the envelopes to campaign for something or get the newsletter out. Take the minutes at the meeting. Get the social things organised. All those kind of really very ordinary jobs, but they all contributed to saving the canal.
But I think for the message, sometimes you lose the whole thing, but you can remember the anecdotes in any thought. So your shows are just full of quality anecdotes.
Yes.
But I Did Canals isn't the end of the story. I think this is where we're getting to what we want,
Yes,
the message we want to put over.
This is the bit you've got to listen to carefully.
And the bit we really want your help for.
Yes. The I Did Canals focused on the Black Country and was wonderful and fascinating. But earlier this year we got a grant from the Sir John Feeney Trust in Birmingham to extend the project and capture some stories in Birmingham. It is not as big a grant or as extensive, so we're aiming to reach a smaller number of people. But we now want to hear from women who were involved in any way near to around the canals. So we have talked to some who were involved. It has proved a little bit harder because I think in the Black Country with the Staffs and Worcester and Stourbridge, wonderful story that, little plug, you'll find on YouTube, done by Heather, called The Battle of Stourbridge. There was a lot to fight for in terms of saving the canals.
Yeah.
And I think in central Birmingham, although the Birmingham Canals Navigation Society had started, I think in the 60s,
Yeah.
and was certainly involved, there's a different feel to Birmingham. I think there was still more trade going on.
It continued
more working.
right up to the end.
Yes, and as industry, and things like Stewart's and Lloyd's, which actually isn't in Birmingham, but some of that big industry, it went on until the 80s, didn't it?
Yes.
And so what we want to do is to hear stories from that more central bit of Birmingham. So we know people lived on boats in Gas Street, for example. Brummage and Boats, the hire company,
Sure.
was working from the wharf, I can't remember the name of, at the end of Ouzel's Loop.
Yes.
Long pause.
It's Sherborne Wharf.
Sherborne Wharf, that's the one. And the one place that particularly interests me, because Jenny talked about it in her first interview, is Hockley Port and Hockley Port Association, because that was clearly in the 70s and 80s doing some great work around the canal and with the community, but is no longer there.
I suppose.
And it would be wonderful to hear and celebrate and preserve some of the stories of what they achieved.
So I suppose really it's the story from a female voice.
Yeah.
Yep, from a female voice, looking for the transition of the central Birmingham section, which is Farmers Bridge, Locks, Gas Street Basin, out onto Hockley Port Loop. The transition from the old industrial 1960s, 70s sort of era through to the modern Brindley Place bright shiny centrepiece that it is today, and things like presumably like the old IWA rally that happened on the site of what is now Symphony Hall and
Yes.
the ICC,
Yes,
all the things
yes.
that happened, but we're looking for the female voice from that last, so it doesn't have to be the old working boats specifically,
No,
but
not
that
at
transition.
No, you might have been involved. I don't know whether there was quite as many working parties around that bit of the BCN as there were further out in the Black Country, because working parties is something people talked about a lot with the first I did Canals. But if you went to an event, or you had anything to do with Hockley Port, or perhaps you worked in an industry that was linked to the canal, either boats came and collected from you, or you just happened to look at it every day. We know that the towpath was fenced off and was technically private, but we also know that lots of people walked or played or fooled around down there, so that's another round of stories.
And if it wasn't you who was there, but you know someone who you think would have an insight into this, can you include it and forward it on, like it, share it, do whatever is necessary to get them to come forward? And it doesn't have to be a lot, just a few little anecdotes for things that you remember.
It might just be a particular moment or something that happened or somebody you met. So if you came to something like the IWA event or some other event. And what we didn't talk about before we started was how to tell us these things. So,
well, I suppose obviously you can get directly in touch with yourselves. You'll have a web presence?
We do. We are Alarum Productions, all one word, .org.uk. We are on social media, so you will find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok as Alarum Prod. And an email address is hello@alarumproductions.org.uk.
And if all that is just too complicated, you can simply put a comment in the box below and send it to me and I'll get in touch with you.
Yeah, that'll do nicely.
So, thank you in anticipation, and I'm looking forward to your next production.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Kate,
it's been really interesting to talk to you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye,
Bye.
Bill.